The important point I want to emphasize, though, is propaganda is not education. Propaganda, on whether it's TikTok or in the classroom, is actually the opposite of education. Anybody who is teaching in a university or anyone who is putting content on social media should be held responsible for what they include and what they exclude. And so much of what we're seeing, particularly on TikTok, about what's going on in the Middle East is woefully false, but it's also incredibly slanted, pro-Hamas, anti-Israel. And it is, not any place where anyone should go to get information about complex matters like what is going on there. So we have to do a much better job in trying to, number one, teach history at all levels. That's why I love SUFs, because it's about our history. It's a part of history we didn't all study and learn about. But it's also important that we recognize the propaganda value of social media.
All right. My name is Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument, where we are not yet held responsible for what we include and what we omit. But, God willing, the neoliberal commissariat of information may one day rectify that. And we could stop being so irresponsible here. But I am joined, as always, by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. Before we get into the meat of what we're doing today, a couple things. One, we just finalized all the details on this and, created the event page for the tickets and everything on Friday. So we have the book launch for my pamphlet from Everyday Analysis, publishers of other pamphlets by people like past guest Slavoj Žižek and, serial past guest Jason Miles. So my pamphlet, 4 essays on Palestine, is it is officially out, and we're doing the U.S. book launch on October 22nd. So that's October 22nd. That is, what is that? That's like 2 weeks from tomorrow at Lawless Brewing Company in North Hollywood in Los Angeles, with me, Anna Kasparian, Jason Miles, possibly some other people. I think we're doing it outdoors in a beer garden, so you might meet my dog. But I haven't been to that specific place, but in my experience, bars with outdoor seating in Southern California tend to be pretty chill about that. So we're going to do a little panel out of the beer garden, and then we'll hang out. We're keeping the ticket price down to $5, including fees. So this is not going to be profitable for anybody, but it's really as much of it as anything, way to keep track of numbers for the venue. And also Everyday Analysis is not a giant operation, so I could not finagle them sending that many copies for this. So the ticket to the event comes with a physical copy of the book. So we literally just that's why there's only a limited number of tickets available, because there are only going to be so many copies of the book that we have. Of course, you can always order it, direct from Everyday Analysis. Links to both of those things, the event at Lawless Brewing Company in North Hollywood on Tuesday, October 22nd at 7:30 p.m., and also the link to order the book itself. Those are all down below the box where you are watching us talk right now. So that's how that works. Okay. Second thing, while we are remembering this stuff, so we keep meaning to do this, and this week we finally did it. We have a petition to posthumously exonerate Ethel Rosenberg that we've been meaning to promote. I think, Andy, you brought this to my attention. You want to give people some background here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually very fortunate enough to live right near the Rosenberg Fund for Children, and I've been to their offices before and seen like they have really cool original art by famous people. But the bottom line is that they actually do really great work to to actually raise money for activists who are in prison for their children, to help them get their education that they need, get school supplies, that kind of stuff, which is wonderful. But the whole reason why the foundation exists is because the Rosenbergs, who were actually communists, were executed back in the 1950s, because they were accused of selling nuclear secrets to the Russians. And it is 100% true that Ethel Rosenberg did not have anything to do with it. Like there was zero evidence. Everything was made up. Part of the reason why she was executed was also to kind of keep secret the fact that we broke the translation of the Russian spy ring, and so we knew more than what we actually were letting out in court. But the bottom line is that she shouldn't have been executed, and she was absolutely innocent of the charges that she was accused of, and we need Biden to exonerate her. Fun fact: one of the prosecutors was Roy Cohn, Donald Trump's attorney. So there's a insane connection right there.
That is an insane connection. Yeah, well, fair enough. It's always been an interesting case to me because, like, if you assume, my understanding is that Julius probably did have some involvement in espionage. Ethel, it seems to actually be cleared by declassified documents. Although, again, the record's never been legally cleared. I think even with Julius, it's a little unclear what the.
Yeah, it seems like his brother-in-law, who was caught in England initially with the spy ring, he seemed to be the one kind of pushing him into it. Like a good FBI informant does.
Right. And this whole idea that, like, I don't know, that the whole premise about the nuclear secret, I think, like, the kind of logistics of, like, oh well, the Soviets never would have gotten the nuke, but then they, there's like a there's something that Julius could just draw on a napkin and pass over to them, and they're like, oh shit, that's how you do it, okay, now we got it right, is like probably a little bit dubious anyway. And there's also an interesting question about whether it actually would have been a good thing if only the United States had that, for all those decades. Because, keep in mind, it's as easy as this is to forget, we actually did use it twice, right? In 1945. And it seems to me that in a world where we maintain the nuclear monopoly, it's very likely that at some point in the 79 years since then, would have used it again. But in any case, I think that the case based on the declassified documents that Ethel at least is completely innocent is pretty airtight. And it's I've got to say, I don't know, I mean, there's all this all this concern in the last year about anti-Semitism. It's they have a unjustly convicted Jewish woman, and in a trial where there was like tons of anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant xenophobia floating around. It's like, be a nice gesture.
Yeah, I mean, especially since the important thing too, I really want to point this out. The key word is exonerate and not pardon, because pardon implies that they're guilty, and exonerate means that she was innocent. So that's kind of the big thing.
Yeah. Yeah, fun fact. The first time I ever hung out with Bhaskar Sankara, he accused me of being a racist for thinking that OJ was guilty. So, but as if you're listening to this later on a podcast, that came up in the chat. But in any case, yeah, okay, fair enough. Speaking of Democrats, the first voice that we heard at the beginning of the show was a friend of the show, Hillary Rodham Hilldog Clinton, who sharing her thoughts about free speech and the conflict in the Middle East. And of course, we we here maybe have a different view than she does of what counts as misleading propaganda about this. And, that's going to come up.
I mean, what does she mean held responsible? Would we have to do a next week an article? An entire episode about all of the pro-Israel points that we missed.
Yeah.
But which for Hillary usually boils down to like the one failed deal that that her husband tried to do before. Like she always brings that up. That one, then she's like, and there's many other things we could get into, but
let's hear some of the others.
Yeah, so I don't know under her theoretical neoliberal leadership what would actually be the definition of held responsible, but I'm not sure. I'm sure, and I'm sure that makes Republicans doesn't fuel the fire that liberals are anti-free speech for Republicans or anything like that, right?
Yeah, right. No, certainly. And yeah, I mean, it's like, okay, well, I mean, it can hold us responsible for not talking about the all-important Clinton offer, but then, I want to make sure we have the mechanism to then hold her responsible for not mentioning that was well short of Israel's obligations under international law to completely retreat to its pre-1967 borders. That there were times later that Arafat and his successor said they would in fact take that deal, and it was ignored, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Although, as we'll get into today, I don't even think any of this kind of ephemera about the details of, offers and counter offers is really particularly morally salient or politically insightful if you want to understand the heart of what the issue is, which is what we are going to be getting into as the main event today. So basically, I've been thinking about doing this for a while. Since today is the 1-year anniversary of the beginning of the current round of the war, this seemed like a really good time to do this. So earlier this year, right in the spring, I gave a talk to Detroit, Metro Detroit DSA and Wayne State University YDSA, called Debunking the Many Bad Arguments made by Israel's Apologists in the West. And then a little bit later that semester, so this is in like April, I think, I was invited to give that same talk to the Alliance of Jewish Progressives at Princeton. And originally we were going to do it like in a classroom with, PowerPoint and stuff. But then everybody, of course, at that point was at the encampment. So we ended up just turning it into a teach-in at the encampment. But in neither Detroit nor Princeton, did I or the people I was working with have our stuff together enough to arrange for somebody to film it so we could put it on YouTube. And at one point we were thinking about doing that in LA, and there was kind of this comedy of errors with like trying to line up a venue to do that. And we had a spot. Anyway, it was a whole thing. But then we're certainly not doing it at this point because we're doing the book launch on, basically the same subject real soon anyway. So I figured this would be a good time to just do an on-air version of that presentation, right? I mean, it's basically designed to be like an hour-long lecture. So I'll just do that on air. That's exactly what it sounds like, debunking the many bad arguments made by Israel's apologists in the West. And we'll stay on the same topic for the post game. We're going to watch Coates on CBS. But before we get to any of that, do you guys know there's an election going on right now?
For president?
I think so.
President of what? Because that's what you're saying president, but you're not saying president of what. So
right.
Yeah. I don't know, Ben. I don't follow news as closely as you.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, well, it can't be Mexico because they just swore, like they just did the swearing in of the new president there.
Oh yeah, the Jewish. Oh, sorry, yeah,
Claudia Scheinbaum, who, by the way, this is hilarious to me. Like all of, again, the concern in the last year about anti-Semitism, we have the first Jewish head of state in the Western Hemisphere ever. Was
and
just,
a woman, if you want to keep going on, stuff that you would think that either. I mean, that's more for liberals than for conservatives, but that should make everybody happy. It should make everybody happy, right?
Yeah, I mean, technically, if we're going to do Western Hemisphere, I think Canada had a female prime minister for like 3 months.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I was just, not the first, but
yeah, but still significant. Certainly the first one, in Mexico. But yeah, but yes, but like, far as I know, first Jewish head of state in the Western Hemisphere, literally ever. And one would think that people who are very concerned with identity and historic firsts and all this stuff would take an interest in it. One would think that especially people who express constant concern about anti-Semitism would take an interest in this landmark. But of course, she is a leftist who, is, her party, Morena, in Mexico, right? I mean, she's the successor to AMLO. And with her support, their support in South Africa's case against Israel at the ICJ. So I think the people who are most likely to make noise about this kind of don't care that this Jewish woman is president of Mexico now, which is amazing. My other favorite Claudia Scheinbaum thing is that there was this wonderful minute. I mean, there's a long, much like in the US, there's a long distance between the election and the inauguration of the new president. And at the in her victory speech at the election, there was this weird little Twitter mini scandal where people are like, "Wait a second, isn't she supposed to be Jewish? She thanked Jesus in her victory speech." That would be her husband's name, Jesus. But in any case.
Yeah. So it's not like Norm Greenbaum's Spirit in the Sky, right?
So yeah, turns out there's also an election for president of the United States real soon. Yeah, I know, right? More you know. Real soon, even. In fact, early voting is going on, but we have Hillary Clinton, who we started with, has generously offered her services. We have the headline here: Hillary Clinton is advising Kamala Harris on how to beat Trump. I mean, I'm just not even gonna say the obvious thing. I think we can just let that hang in the air. But in any case, as far as the overall efforts to beat Trump, I did want to take a little look at the VP debate. So it, I did watch the entire thing, so I could write about it for Jacobin. The article was called, I think, nobody at the VP debate. The VP debate, neither candidate spoke up for peace. It is exactly what it sounds like. There's a lot you can say about this. I think Tim Walz, who's generally good on TV, was not particularly good in the debate. I suspect that might have something to do with the fact that he's been stashed in a basement somewhere for the last month, and he was still kind of blinking at the sunlight when he did the debate, whereas JD Vance has been doing hundreds of media availabilities. But yes, wasn't Waltz's best performance. He said at one point that he was friends with school shooters, which I'm pretty sure is not what he meant to say. But to my mind, the worst part was his answer to the question about Iran.
Earlier today, Iran launched its largest attack yet on Israel, but that attack failed. thanks to joint U.S. and Israeli defensive action. President Biden has deployed more than 40,000 U.S. military personnel and assets to that region over the past year to try to prevent a regional war. Iran is weakened, but the U.S. still considers it the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and it has drastically reduced the time it would take to develop a nuclear weapon. It is down now to 1 or 2 weeks' time. Governor Walz, if you were the final voice in the Situation Room, would you support or oppose a preemptive strike by Israel on Iran? You have 2 minutes.
Well, thank you. And thank you for those joining at home tonight. Let's keep in mind where this started. October 7th, Hamas terrorists massacred over 1,400 Israelis and took prisoners. Israel's ability to be able to defend itself is absolutely fundamental. Getting its hostages back, fundamental, and ending the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. But the expansion of Israel and its proxies is an absolute fundamental necessity for the United States to have the steady leadership there. You saw it experienced today, where along with our Israeli partners and our coalition, able to stop the incoming attack.
Yeah, not great. I think that framing everything that's gone on in the last year in terms of Israel's right to self-defense is pretty appalling. I also wrote for Jacobin today, actually, this article on the anniversary of 10/7. 1 year after 10/7, Israel's eye for an eye logic must end. And, the basic point made in the article is that, if you think that, Israel's right to defend itself extends to this kind of, not even an eye for an eye, like 100 eyes, per eye, killing tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians directly, by credible estimates, when you add in the indirect deaths, we could be up to a couple 100,000.
There was a letter today from a bunch of doctors, which put the number at around 109,000.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, a very conservative estimate.
Yeah. There's another one that's a bit higher that's been around, but yeah. And, something like 96,000 injuries, I think, is the last number that I saw. Gaza right now, keep in mind, this is a tiny territory. It's 25 miles long, right? It has the world's biggest population of child amputees. And, this is like, okay, in the teach-in talk that, I'll be doing later in the episode, go through this like much more analytical kind of look at the bigger issues and the conflict and the background and all of that stuff, of course. And that's not what this article was, right? This article is just making the points like, look, if that kind of ocean of death and suffering is justified by sort of eye for an eye retaliation for, let's say 695 Israeli civilians who were killed on October 7th, then applying the same logic, what would be justified as a response to that, right? If you can sort of apply that same kind of, 100 eyes per eye retaliation, and then imagine that, even trying to figure out what would have to be inflicted, on the Israeli population to balance the scales is kind of staggering to think about. And of course, if you reject, if you think that's like a grotesque idea, you should, right? But that cuts in both directions. And ultimately, what's so disturbing about that Waltz answer, besides just the fact that I obviously think he's wrong about Palestine, is that the context here is, people talk about a danger of a regional war as if it wasn't already happening. But of course, Lebanon is being bombed. Yemen is being bombed. Iran is, going to be very soon. There are Israeli ground troops, occurring further into Lebanon right now. That's a reality. But I mean, the region is being pulled deeper and deeper into this war that could very easily escalate to the point where there were American ground troops there. And look, what have we learned here? Right? Like, the Bush era wars in the Middle East lasted for 20 years. They were disastrous. Everybody acknowledges that, right? I mean, Walt certainly, but I mean, like, J.D. Vance has scored points off of retroactively opposing the invasion of Iraq 20 years before he went into national politics. But all these people are, cheerleading for this now. And, it's like, if you just kind of say, oh, well, right to defend yourself, what are you going to do? Right. That's what matters here. Wave the flag, then you're just going to get the logic of the situation is getting grimmer and grimmer and grimmer. Right. That's the point. And I think we can actually maybe put a finer point on why that answer was so bad by contrasting it to what I thought, at least, was actually Vance's best moment in the debate, which is when they were arguing about abortion.
Governor, would you like to respond and also answer the question about restrictions?
Yeah, well, the question got asked, and Donald Trump made the accusation that wasn't true about Minnesota. Well, let me tell you about this idea that there's diverse states. There's a young woman named Amber Thurman. She happened to be in Georgia, a restrictive state. Because of that, she had to travel a long distance to North Carolina to try and get her care. Amber Thurman died in that journey back and forth. The fact of the matter is, how can we as a nation say that your life and your rights, as basic as the right to control your own body, is determined on geography? There's a very real chance, had Amber Thurman lived in Minnesota, she would be alive today.
All right. So what is he doing in that answer? He is, he's foregrounding the basic principle, right? That your right to control your own body shouldn't depend on geography. It's very simple. It's very forceful. It's very easy to understand. He is naming specific people who have died as a result of the policy that he's opposed to. And all that is just gone, right? When he's talking about the Middle East, right? There are no clear principles here that he finds relevant. There's certainly none that he feels the need to share here. There are no names, right? It's like you think nobody in Gaza or Lebanon has had a miscarriage because they couldn't get to the hospital. Like, you could do the exact equivalent here, but he doesn't, right? And this is not really a Tim Walz thing particularly. I actually think he's the best of a bad lot, but it's an American political establishment thing in general. And it's I don't know. It's fucking depressing. I don't have anything else on this.
Yeah, and I think because he was kind of misspeaking the whole debate, I do think it's worth saying that his favorables went way up after the debate. I think it maybe just be his just vibe. Again, well, unfortunately, I mean, maybe they would have gone up even higher if he wasn't kind of misspeaking a lot. But what I was going to say is, I don't think he meant to say the expansion of Israel. I think that was sort of I don't know about Freudian slip, but something like that.
There were several times when he got his Israels and Irans mixed up.
Yeah, it's like he crammed for the test and is not quite expressing himself like the answer he wrote out.
Well, yeah, because it's also probably not what he really thinks, right? Or I don't or he clearly just memorized what he had to say on that one, versus maybe the other issue. It's his home state, and to your point, Ben, not only was it more affecting, but probably more of an actual, like you said, it's probably based in some kind of values that he feels, as opposed to some kind of talking point that there's some very terrifying talking point that he has to parrot because of, all the reasons they have to toe the line on Israel.
Yeah, I mean, look, and this is not to say that he secretly has some great views about Israel-Palestine. It's just to say that, like, it's relatively shallowly held, right? This is just kind of like, this is the stuff that you have to think, and maybe he thinks that it's more or less reasonable, maybe he doesn't, but like, there's no particular reservoir of deep conviction there. Whereas, look, whatever else they are or aren't different on, abortion is something that is clearly a big bright line, right, between the views of the two parties. And certainly, I doubt he spent that much time thinking about Middle Eastern geopolitics, before last year, whereas I'm sure abortion has been something he's been thinking about and, arguing with people about, for a very, very long time, right? So I think you do actually get that passion there.
Yeah, I just wish he kind of put the same intellectual rigor into his answer to the Middle East as he did on abortion.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Want to do some actual good news in all of this, since we do have some from the last week. There was a successful longshoreman strike, and I understand it's like a tentative agreement. It's not the same thing as a contract. There are outstanding issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can all take that. Just because in my experience, when you say this stuff, there's always somebody who shows up to point all this out, right? But basically, we had all the ports on the East Coast and all the ports on the Gulf Coast. The West Coast is actually represented by a different union, but all of the East and Gulf Coast ports shut down in this massive dock strike over basically wages, and also the use of automation to take away the livelihoods of a big chunk of those workers. And in record time, I mean, they've been on strike for less than 3 days, and the bosses caved, certainly at least on the wage piece, in a big way. There's the tentative agreement, has like a 62% pay increase over the course of the next 6 years. So this is a very, very good thing. I wrote about this for MSNBC. Striking, yeah. Could tell I did not write this headline. I really hate these, the word folks. I mean, I used to be kind of okay with it if it was used, if you were managing to strike just the right tone, but I think Obama's "we tortured some folks" killed it for me. But in any case, the headline that MSNBC put on it is "Striking dock workers just set an example for all working folks." And it is basically about the way that, there were all of these, there's all this demonization of the dock workers, certainly in right-wing media, that you had the Wall Street Journal, ran an article about how actually these people are just really entitled. They're already getting paid so much already. And the New York Post did this big expose about the head of the union having a big house and a nice car. No exposés, as far as I know, about any of the executives at the company. And what's maybe more disturbing to me is that you had, certainly liberals and some left of center people who were also not supporting the workers. So you had, certainly something I saw a lot was people saying, look, the head of the union, had a meeting with Trump once and, and said some bland things about how it went well. So therefore the entire strike was a conspiracy to October surprise Kamala Harris. And hand the election to Trump. That was a very popular take on liberal Twitter the morning that the strike started. And I don't know. I don't know if all the dock workers who voted for the strike authorization were in on the conspiracy, but it got worse from there, right? So I think that some of the common themes that I saw were, the dock workers are already making, a living wage. So why are we, sympathetic to them? Why are we siding with them? And, they're standing in the way of progress because the, advance of new technology with automation is ultimately, good for all of us. And then there was this sort of pragmatic thing. So, Li Fang, who I don't dislike at all. I actually agree with Li Fang about lots of stuff. But he had, and nobody should be defined by their worst tweet. But I think this one was pretty bad, right? He said America's labor unions benefiting from the most pro-union presidential administration in 56 years, only to strike and potentially cause crippling inflation only 1 month out from the election. Long history of self-defeats of organized labor, but this one might take the cake. So, what are thoughts?
It's a little funny coming from him because I feel like he's a huge critic also of the Biden administration. I would assume, right? So it's funny, that he's so worried about the risk of but it also is, I think for we do have to entertain the counterfactual, that what if the strike wasn't resolved, and to fully consider his point, we have to, it's like, what if what he said did happen. But I will say the fact that he was so confident that this was such a big own goal, and then like you pointed out, the workers won so quickly, shows that maybe his priors about what was actually going to go on were not very good, right? Because his prediction didn't happen. But like I said, he was working under the assumption something else would happen. So it seems like he was wrong materially, right? But then also I think, from a true pro-labor perspective, I think this is a point you made in the article, Ben, but the whole point of having a union president, right, is that you actually feel empowered to have this kind of strike that will win, major pay and benefits increases for workers, right? That you actually feel empowered to do it. So then to not utilize that is kind of like completely dropping the ball on all of the leverage that you had. And then also people don't really understand, I think, that it's not like I don't think it's this was a key time for them to have leverage, right? It's not like they could just call a strike whenever they want. And they were like, ooh, I know when I can do it, like at the worst possible time. I'm going to sabotage, like this is secretly a pro-Trump plot. So, I mean, I think, like I said, we might maybe to fully account for Lee's thesis, we would have to entertain the counterfactual. But I just think it's if you're only going to support strikes and labor when you think that there's some like perfect strategic time where it's actually like incredibly liberal logic, right? And by I mean like neoliberal or centrist logic, which I don't really expect Fang to ascribe to. So it was just surprising to see that from him.
Yeah, I think that's right. So this is, and it's kind of the smallest part of it, but just to be clear to your point about timing, they could have done a contract extension and hit the snooze button on the strike, but if they'd done that, they really would have lost the leverage that they had by getting in before the pre-holiday shipping season, right? Which is just like a huge time of potential lost profits for the industry, right? I mean, if they'd tried to do this in a couple months, the iron would not have been nearly as hot.
And also strikes require their democratic require authorization. Right. If you have all this energy to strike, it's not necessarily so easy to be like, oh, actually, let's do it in 2 months when we have less leverage because we're worried about this Biden or about Kamala.
Yeah,
Kamala.
exactly.
It's not really pragmatic. It's not understanding the process, I would say.
Exactly, right. And I would also just say, like, one quick point each about the wages and automation and but Biden has been so pro labor, right? So first of all, in the automation, I think the issue is not whether technology is going to continue to advance or not. Of course it will. It's how that's going to be used and whose interests it's going to be used in, right? I mean, look, here's something you could do. Shipping companies aren't gonna, but they could, right? They could, they could introduce new forms of automation, new technology that make like half of the labor currently done by longshoremen redundant, and just use it to reduce everybody's hours, right? Like, nothing's stopping them, right? It's just not the profit maximizing strategy for them. If the workers owned the companies themselves, then that might actually very well be what they decided to do. But it's, I think said, oh, well, technological progress, yes or no, is kind of missing the point. The question is technological progress in what way and whose interests? Look, I'm sure most people watching this are not longshoremen, but this is, as AI gets better, certainly, I mean, this is going to be something that leaves very few things untouched, right? So if I think we could implement this in a way that's going to immiserate, most people, or we could implement it in a better way, right? And the only way that workers get any sort of say in that, right, is if they flex their muscles collectively in very much the way the longshoremen are. Right? So that's one point. On the wages, I think this is actually incredibly revealing that, so many people were sort of making this, oh, well, they already make a, living wage. They already have good wages, whatever. It's like, okay, first of all, let's not exaggerate the point here that my understanding is first of all, what you're being paid per hour is a little bit of a different question from, what your actual yearly take-home pay is, because especially if you're not in one of the busier ports, then you're not, it's not necessarily 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. My understanding is a lot of this stuff can kind of be feast or famine. You're working 100 hours a week sometimes and hardly anything, other times. But, most, and also, like, the actual average, like, a lot of these articles are about the top earners, but the average is like $20 an hour, which is, for context, I mean, there are states where you make that if you work at McDonald's, right? I mean, that's the case here. So I think that point is really exaggerated anyway, empirically, but that's not even what matters to me the most about that. What matters to me the most about that is that it's really revealing about what you think the point is of labor organizing. Do you think that labor organizing is an occasionally justifiable way of procuring charity for people who are poor and desperate enough to count as really needing it, right? Or do you think that fundamentally it's important to build power for the working class majority of society at the places where they end up having to spend half of their waking lives, right? And I'd say, in terms of democracy, right, that again, if you have to spend half of your waking life at a place where you have no sort of structural power at all, right, you have the individual power of threatening to quit, but of course that's not worth much for most people, because it's way easier for the company to replace one worker in almost all cases than it is for the worker to replace their source of livelihood. And just in terms of the project of building a more equal society, right? I mean, I think that this is a really, these are two, that sort of, okay, everybody deserves more of a say in what happens where they work, versus, oh, this is this like tool that can help us alleviate, the conditions of the sort of particularly deserving victims who are, desperate enough for us to feel sorry for them, are completely different worldviews and completely incompatible worldviews, right? So I think there's a real to quote one of my all-time least favorite politicians, right? It's a time of choosing, right? As far as that goes. But lastly, on the point about the election, again, I think that there is a fundamental question here of how you see the role of, an organized working class. Because even putting aside the fact that Kamala Harris is not the same person as Joe Biden, and in fact, there have been a lot of very worrying sort of signs that she might be a more orthodox neoliberal in some ways than Joe Biden. We'll see. At least if she pulls out the election, we'll see. Otherwise, we'll just have to wonder. But even putting that aside, look, Biden's record is actually pretty mixed. He's certainly been, pro-labor by the standards of the last bunch of presidents. That's true, right? It's also, it's like William F. Buckley's obituary for Michael Harrington. He said he was the most famous socialist in America, which is a little bit like being the tallest building in Wichita, Kansas, right? Like it's, the standard is in the gutter, right? For recent American presidents. And it's certainly true that that out of Biden was the best of the bunch in many ways, but it's also true that he came into office making a big deal about how he was going to do the PRO Act to make it easier to organize unions, and the standard list of excuses applies, but the fact remains that it never seems to have been a particularly high priority for his administration. And in fact, in a very similar situation to the dock strike 2 years ago, with the potential rail strike, he did the equivalent of what he didn't do this time, right? Like, so this time he said, "Oh, I don't believe in Taft-Hartley," and which is great, right? But apparently he does believe in the Railway Labor Act, because he did invoke that to stop the rail strike 2 years ago. All of which is just to say, look, if this is the most pro-labor recent president, which he is, then I think that shows you something about the severe limits of putting your trust in politicians to protect workers' interests rather than workers organizing to protect those interests themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think the last thing I would say is, like, literally the only reason that you could think of be a mistake would be that, like, very limited pragmatic calculus, which, if this tentative agreement holds, wasn't true anyway. You know what I mean? And I think that given all of the insane ways in which things are stacked against unions and workers, I think I think just in terms of solidarity, your first bias should be to support any workers who are standing up for themselves. And if you find yourself on the side of management, maybe there's some insane situation in which you find yourself on the side of management, but that really, especially in our society, should not be your first instinct. But I just think, in terms of the not now argument, I guess I'm not saying that it's false 100% of the time, but I feel like anyone on the left, whether it's a protest, right, whether it's a strike, whether it's taking any kind of stand, I feel like the response you could get from the center left is, yeah, you have a good idea, but I agree, workers should have rights, but not now, right? Not now. Put it off. It's not strategic right now.
Yeah, we gotta help Kamala.
No, Kamala, she can support. When she gets in office, she'll show basic human decency for the Palestinians. But for now, we need to win this election. And I'm not saying that. Listen, I
unfortunately, this is the last election, so that's come up again.
Yeah. So I think it's. I'm not saying to throw away the pragmatist book or whatever, because I think that's going too far. But it's just something you hear so often that it's very hard to really buy into that argument.
You get that sense of, right, was the Red Queen from Alice in Wonderland, right? Always jam tomorrow, never jam today. And also I just think it puts the cart before the horse, that the problem with saying, oh, well, don't, exercise that power directly, just trust politicians to protect your interests on your behalf, is that right now, and I'm not doing a both parties the same argument. I think they're clearly not on this issue, right? But even with the Democrats, right now, working class just has very little political sway within the process right now, right? I mean, I think you can see that even in the very mixed record of the Biden administration. And, you're just never going to be in a position to exert more political influence if you're sort of always willing to politely, hold off on exercising power when it's inconvenient, for politicians. Before we drop this subject, got to do the Dylan Matthews tweet. He says, refusing to invoke Taft-Hartley. This is Dylan Matthews from Vox. Refusing to invoke Taft-Hartley to avert a devastating port strike that threatens to cause inflation to come roaring back weeks before an election in which Democrats will lose longshoremen in a landslide is the perfect encapsulation of Dems' cargo cultish approach to labor. So that is one liberal vote for invoking Taft-Hartley. And I don't have anything to say about this beyond, boo, shame.
Gross.
Do better, Dylan. Exactly. I know you can. I've looked inside your heart. Although I did confuse you with Zach Beauchamp when I was talking to Ben about this. It's the same shit, right? All those guys.
Yeah, more or less. Fair enough. Okay. Well, on that note, I will see you guys in the post game for patrons. But right now, gonna do the talk again. This is the talk I gave to Metro Detroit DSA and Wayne State DSA, and then a little bit later at the encampment at Princeton. And this is closer to the second version. But since we couldn't get anybody to film in either of those cases, figured for posterity or just do it again on the show. This would be the day to do it. I will skip the opening paragraph about how I was thanking the Alliance for Jewish Progressives for inviting me and being so happy to be speaking at the future site of Rutgers Princeton when we nationalized Princeton and brought it into the state university system in New Jersey. But in any case, starting right after that, before I get into the meat of the talk, I want to clarify a little bit about what I will and won't be doing here, because I'm not a historian of Israel-Palestine or any sort of credentialed expert on Middle Eastern geopolitics. I'm someone who, since I started podcasting and started writing for Jacobin several years ago, has spent a lot of time analyzing and responding to things like libertarian arguments against socialism or centrist arguments against Medicare for all, and who's gotten more and more interested in doing the same kind of thing for foreign policy in the last couple of years. That's not to say that the foreign policy interest is itself new, very far from it. I was supposed to graduate from college in spring 2003. I am sadly extremely old, but I ended up graduating a semester late because I was spending all my time organizing anti-war protests, and I managed to fail a graduation requirement any sentient being should have passed. And God knows I've been reading about and talking about and arguing with people about Palestine for literally as long as I could remember having political arguments about anything. But I'm not here to stack up what books I've read or what details about which peace negotiations I can recall against anyone else's knowledge of this stuff, because that is just absolutely not the point. I really want to focus on the arguments made by apologists for Israel, not just their facts, but their inferences, because I want to push back hard against the idea that this stuff is all terribly, capital C, complicated. And if you don't have a deep expertise in Middle Eastern geopolitics and you haven't spent 6 months there and speak, fluent Hebrew and Arabic, you should just shut up and defer to people who do, even if every moral intuition you have is screaming that what the bipartisan establishment says about this subject is vile. I think taking democracy seriously means believing that we can all think for ourselves and think through whether the arguments make sense even on their own terms. So the perspective I'm bringing to this is not I'm the expert and I'm here to tell you what's what. It's you guys and I are all citizens of what's supposed to be a democracy, and our country is arming and financing and providing diplomatic cover for what looked to me like really serious human rights abuses and atrocities. And we're all being confronted with all sorts of propagandistic arguments about why this is all actually okay. So what I'm here to do is to use whatever knowledge I have of how arguments work to help show you how I'd work through what's wrong with these arguments. And maybe I hope all that can help you guys give good responses to the same arguments when you confront them in a variety of contexts in your own lives and your own activism. So to start at a view from 10,000 feet, before we get to the specific atrocities in, God, that's depressing. It says the last 6 months. At this point, it's the last year. Let's just think about Zionism as a baseline proposition. Even some people who think the displacement of millions of Gazans and the use of starvation as a weapon of war and the most indiscriminate bombing campaign in the recent history of the world, even people who think all that stuff is a bit much, will show how reasonable and centrist they are by saying things like, Israel has a right to exist, or maybe even Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. But what exactly does any of that mean? I really want you guys to slow down and think about this one with me. First, what does it mean to say that any state has a right to exist? Are nation states the kind of things that even have that right? And then especially, what would it mean to have a right to exist as a Jewish state? Because adding that phrase is a very, very big addition. In fact, it completely changes the meaning of the sentence. One thing Israel has a right to exist could mean is that Israel has a right to not be militarily invaded by an outside power. In fact, what the phrasing Israel has a right to exist is meant to evoke is the idea that has a right against some outside power not only invading, but committing genocide against the Israeli Jewish population. And yep, I agree, that would be bad. Israeli Jews have a right to have that not happen to them. But also, if that's actually what people are talking about, why does anybody bother insisting on that as if that were on the table as a historical possibility? You might as well say that the United States has a right not to be invaded by Canada and have the Canadians ethnically cleanse everybody in the US who can't speak French. Sure, that's a hypothetical scenario that would be bad, but it's also not going to happen. There is a 0.000% chance. The things that are on the table in a broad historical sense, although even these are wildly improbable in the short term, sadly, would be for Israel to be successfully pressured to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza and allow an independent Palestinian state to be formed there, or more ambitiously, for there to be a movement inside Israel that succeeded internally in turning it into a very different kind of state, the way that South Africa was never invaded, but it did internally become a very different kind of state when the system of white rule there ended at the beginning of the 1990s. When people say Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state, what they're really signaling is their opposition to that second idea. What they really mean would be better expressed by just saying Israel has a right to be a Jewish state. But they don't say that because for rhetorical purposes, they want the idea that Israel has a right to be a Jewish state mixed up with the idea that Israel has a right not to be wiped out from outside, since that second right is a whole lot more defensible than the first one. So they say right to exist as a Jewish state. But let's be serious and talk about what they're really saying, that Israel has a right to be a Jewish state. So does it? What does that even mean? If the problem, is it a problem if Israel is a nation state that happens to have a Jewish majority? No, of course not. But does Israel have a right to be a nation state where the majority of citizens are Jewish, such that this right justifies doing things like giving every Jewish person on the planet a right to migrate to Israel while denying the same right to Palestinians whose grandparents were ethnically cleansed from the country in 1948 and who still literally have the keys to their grandparents' houses? Or things like denying citizenship to millions of West Bank and Gaza Palestinians who Israel has ruled over for the last 57 years? And to that, I'd say, of course not. No nation state has a right to have any particular ethnic or religious majority forever. Certainly not a strong enough right to that to justify mistreating minorities. If someone told you that the United States had a right to be a white Christian state, and this could justify enacting discriminatory immigration laws that would let in white Christians from anywhere in the world, but deny the rights of non-whites or non-Christians to come over, then we'd all call that person a fascist. And what Israel does to maintain its ethnic majority is much worse than just having discriminatory immigration laws, much more indefensible. Well, if you say all this to a Zionist, you'll likely hear one of two things. One is that Israel is the world's only Jewish state. But why is that relevant? Again, compare the world's only white Christian state. Imagine the United States had the discriminatory immigration policies I just laid out, while all the other historically white and Christian societies in the world had eased up on that and let non-white and non-Christian people immigrate and just settled into being secular multi-ethnic democracies. Would you say, well, since the United States is the only white Christian ethno-state left in the world, it surely has a right to continue to be one? I don't think so. I think you'd say, great, racial and religious discrimination has been defeated everywhere else, just one to go. The other thing that you'll be told at this point in the argument is that these were all bad analogies, because the reason there needs to be a Jewish ethno-state, even though there does not need to be a white Christian ethno-state, is because of the Holocaust. Because after the Holocaust, there needed to be a guaranteed sanctuary state for Jewish refugees. But first, you could simply have a state that provided guaranteed sanctuary to anyone anywhere in the world who is fleeing an attempted genocide. That seems like a better and more targeted solution than a state that provides guaranteed sanctuary to every Jewish person, whether they're actually in need of sanctuary or not, but which not only denies sanctuary to all kinds of other people who need it, and which in fact creates huge population of new refugees who now need to find sanctuary somewhere else. Second, 10 seconds of thought should be sufficient to tell you how much safer it is to be an American Jew than an Israeli Jew. Not even close. Almost no one is ever killed in America for being Jewish. Hate crimes exist, but American Jews dying that way is vanishingly rare. While the chances of dying for one's group membership are vastly higher in Israel, precisely because a discriminatory ethno-state that mistreats other groups creates a dynamic far more likely to lead to cyclical attacks and counterattacks, atrocities and counter-atrocities than secular multi-ethnic democracy does. As a proposition for guaranteeing Jewish safety, secular multi-ethnic democracy just beats the hell out of an exclusionary ethno-state. And of course, there is a giant contradiction in Zionist rhetoric on this point, a contradiction that should be visible from space, which is that we're constantly told both that Israel has a right to exist just in case the United States ever stops being the most welcoming place for Jews in the entire history of the Jewish diaspora and suddenly swings to becoming genocidally anti-Semitic, right? That's the, oh, Jews in Germany thought they were safe talking point. But we're also told that it's very important that the U.S. supports Israel because Israel is supposedly constantly in danger of being wiped out by its many enemies, and without U.S. support, it has no hope. And ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends, you really do have to choose between one or the other of these talking points. And frankly, you should choose neither, because both are abject nonsense with no meaningful connection to reality. And both are ways of justifying immense amounts of real life violence and real life oppression directed against innocent people in the name of heading off purely hypothetical science fiction scenarios in which the violence and oppression would suddenly start flowing in the opposite direction. An argument I constantly see, Brianna Wu, for example, made it to me during our debate earlier this year, is that Palestine solidarity activists say that Israel is an apartheid state, but they must be wrong, right? They must be wrong because there are Arab citizens of Israel who are doctors and lawyers or elected members of the Knesset. This is an extremely silly argument for two reasons. One is that it's ridiculous to infer from Israeli Arabs having most of the same rights as Israeli Jews, and Israeli Arabs, being doctors or lawyers or Knesset members, that therefore Israeli Arabs don't have a distinctly second-class status, a much worse one, in fact, than any minority group in the contemporary United States. I'll come back to that one in a moment. The other, and actually much more important point, is that when people say that Israel is an apartheid state, they almost never have the status of Israeli Arabs in mind as at least the primary issue. They're talking about the status of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. The thing to keep in mind when people talk about a two-state or one-state solution to the conflict is that there has been a single state from the river to the sea for 57 years. Between 5 and 10% of the Israeli Jewish population, depending on which figures you believe, live in Israeli settlements in the West Bank. These Israelis have all the same rights as other Israeli citizens. They vote in Israeli elections, which of course West Bank Palestinians living minutes away can't do. If a settler is accused of a crime, they're tried in a real court, whereas those Palestinian neighbors, when they're accused of a crime, are tried in military courts. Israeli settlers in the West Bank are legally considered to live in Israel rather than living abroad. And of course, they can travel back and forth between their homes and other parts of Israel without anything like the grim system of checkpoints and authoritarian control to which their Palestinian neighbors are subjected as a matter of course. The West Bank is tightly integrated into Israel for every possible legal and practical purposes, except to give the Palestinians who live there Israeli citizenship, which of course hasn't happened for one reason and one reason only. I've never met a Zionist who was shy about saying this explicitly, that if it did happen, Israeli Jews would no longer be a clear majority of the state's population. Instead, you would now have a state with approximately equal numbers of Jewish and Palestinian citizens, which racists equate with the quote-unquote destruction of Israel. Perhaps one day there'll be some unpredictable geopolitical earthquake that could make a two-state partition a real possibility, or better yet, from my perspective, a different kind of unpredictable geopolitical earthquake that could make a single state with equal rights for everybody a real possibility. But for right now, you have a single state from the river to the sea with wildly unequal rights for different people, depending on their ethnicity or religion. That's textbook apartheid, and no premise about the status of Israeli Arabs could possibly be relevant to that point. Even if Israeli Arabs, in other words, those Palestinian families, the same population, who ended up on the Israeli side of the Green Line after about 750,000 other Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from the country in 1948. So even if Israeli Arabs had completely equal rights in every single way, it would still be irrelevant. The same way that if in 25 of the 50 states, Black people and white people had completely equal rights, but in the other 25 states, Black people were denied citizenship on the basis of their race, in that hypothetical scenario, it would obviously be correct to call the United States an apartheid state. And of course, it's not true that Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews have completely equal rights. Quite a bit of the land in the country is controlled by the Jewish National Fund, for example, which openly discriminates on the basis of ethnicity and religion and who it leases land to. And Israeli Arabs who marry West Bank Palestinians are legally barred from living together as married couples within Israel, allegedly for security reasons, but very obviously for demographic reasons. And Israeli politicians will very openly talk about how it's important to make sure the Jewish birth rate is higher to preserve the demographic edge within the Green Line. And they'll very openly say it would be unacceptable for a prime minister to rely on the support of Arab parties to cobble together a majority coalition in the Knesset, because relying on non-Jewish support would undermine that government's Zionist legitimacy. So you cannot tell me with a straight face that that Arab citizens of the Israeli ethno-state have a completely equal status. They are obviously very far from that. There are, Arab parties are often disqualified from participating in elections if they get too anti-Zionist in their political demands. They question Israel's right to be a Jewish state. We could go on and on and on. But again, even if we pretend, for the sake of argument, that premise one is completely true, Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews have equal rights, the only way I can see how it could even be supposed to be relevant to the conclusion that Israel's not an apartheid state is if we fill in this missing premise by saying, if Israeli Arabs aren't denied rights because of their ethnicity, then no one in Israel is denied rights because of their ethnicity, right? If Israeli Arabs aren't denied citizenship because they're Arabs rather than Jews, therefore no one is denied Israeli citizenship despite living there because they're an Arab rather than a Jew. And of course, that's not true. Nobody even pretends that that's true. That's not in dispute. Once we spell out that premise, instead of just leaving it implied, it's hard for even the most ardent Zionists to endorse the argument with a straight face. Now, there is a certain kind of Israeli apologist in the West who thinks Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state and would argue with much of what I've said so far, but would say, oh, I don't like the West Bank settlements. I hate the Likud fanatics and the settlers. I want a two-state solution. But despite saying this, still finds ways to defend Israel's 57 years of ruling over millions of West Bank and Gaza Palestinians while denying them citizenship or equal rights. Trust me when I say I've been arguing with people like that for decades. So let's think through their arguments. One of the most common arguments, especially since October 7th, is simple denialism about the Gaza part of the occupation. People will say, oh, what are you talking about, Gaza? Israel ended its occupation of Gaza in 2005. In fact, apologists for the occupation will often speak as if Gaza had seceded and become an independent state in 2005. They come very close to just saying this outright. They'll say things like, oh, if Hamas had spent resources on building up the Gazan economy instead of fighting Israel, Gaza would be a prosperous state right now. It would be, like an Arab Singapore. But of course, not only did Israel never relinquish its territorial claim on Gaza and allow an independent state to be formed there, but in a very real sense, between the so-called disengagement in 2005 to 2006 and the new phase of the war that started on October 7th of last year, the occupation in Gaza throughout that entire time was way more brutal than the occupation in the West Bank. What happened in 2005 to 2006 was that Israel withdrew its ground troops and the always pretty insignificant number of settlers. The vast majority of settlers were always in the West Bank rather than Gaza. And they withdrew the ground troops and settlers, not in order to leave Gaza alone, but rather to turn Gaza into something like an open-air prison for millions of civilians, extremely tightly controlled by the Israeli military and bombed so routinely that Israelis politicians would charmlessly refer to bombing Gaza as mowing the lawn. We're talking about a 25-mile by 6 or 7 mile strip of land, mostly populated by registered refugees from earlier acts of ethnic cleansing elsewhere in the country. And they aren't allowed to leave that perimeter, what Israelis call the Gaza envelope, except sometimes in very tightly controlled circumstances, with the permission of their occupiers. In fact, during the Great March of Return in 2018, unarmed Gazans were shot to death en masse by the Israeli military for just walking too close to the fence with which Israel has surrounded that tiny strip of land. Think about that. Does that sound like how independent states work? That if you walk too close to the border without crossing it, you can just be shot to death by a foreign military? Israel has maintained strict unflagging control over Gaza's air, land, and sea borders. With the collaboration of Egypt, whose military dictatorship gets immense amounts of U.S. aid almost every year, in large part as a bribe to cooperate with the Israeli occupation regime over Gaza. Israel has, for this entire period, entirely determined who gets in and out and what gets in and out. Smuggling exists, but we're talking about between 2006 and October 7th, 2023, 17 years of a brutal and dehumanizing blockade, during which Israel was at one point literally calculating how many daily calories Gaza's civilians needed to stay alive to determine exactly how much food to allow in. This is all a matter of public record. If you think that if the guards are withdrawn from a prison and stationed all around the edges of the prison with strict orders to shoot anyone who tries to leave and only allow in the bare amount of food that prisoners need to not starve to death, if you think this counts as freeing the prisoners, then I suppose you can say in a consistent way that Israel ended the occupation of Gaza. But my brother, you are using the English language in ways that I do not recognize. This is, by the way, how to think about Hamas. Friend Dave Smith is somebody I disagree with about almost everything, except for at least much of foreign policy. He's a crazy libertarian who wants to privatize everything. Obviously, the political point of my life has been the opposite of that. But he does have some good lines about this subject. And what he said about Hamas in his debate with RFK Jr. is what I would consider to be the final word on that subject. The only thing anybody needs to say about Hamas. Do I like Hamas? Do I support Hamas? Do I, think it has good and admirable political goals, or that it, has moral tactics? Of course not. Note all of that. But what Dave said is the way to think about Hamas is that they're just the toughest gang in an Israeli prison. If you want Hamas to go away, end the occupation. Otherwise, but Hamas is just a crutch to lean on when justifying denying millions of people their human rights. One last point on Hamas and the occupation of Gaza. After Netanyahu's right-wing predecessor, Ariel Sharon, made that shift in how the occupation of Gaza was administered in 2005, high-ranking officials in his government said very openly that the purpose of the disengagement was to stop any sort of diplomatic momentum in the direction of an independent Palestinian state by making sure there wasn't a unified Palestinian leadership in the West Bank and Gaza, because Hamas was more powerful in Gaza and Fatah more powerful in the West Bank. Netanyahu supported it, and he brags openly now about how much he did to prevent the formation of a Palestinian state. So for Zionists to turn around now and act as if Gaza was an independent state, or like close enough to an independent state, frankly involves hitherto unimaginable quantities of geopolitical chutzpah. As does saying that October 7th was unprovoked. I don't think Hamas was morally justified in killing civilians or taking civilians hostage on October 7th. I think deliberately killing or kidnapping civilians is always wrong, which is a theme we're about to come back to in a big way. But the idea that any attack originating in Gaza could possibly be unprovoked is a genuinely wild thing to say as far as the causation goes. It's even harder to justify the occupation of the West Bank because the presence of a massive number of Israeli soldiers and settlers makes it impossible for even the most shameless propagandists to pretend it hasn't been continuously occupied by Israel since 1967. Some particularly shameless ones, I suppose, will make a great hay of the Palestinian Authority running, parts of the West Bank, right, areas B and C, that in different ways to different extents. But this is literally an Israeli-financed military subcontractor that's become wildly unpopular in the West Bank because of its decades of collaboration with the Israeli army. So instead, what we usually get are a number of arguments where the premises are always some wildly tendentious account of the long history of partition plans proposed by various actors, of negotiations that fell apart, of offers and counteroffers, sometimes going back to the Peel Commission in 1937, sometimes starting with the Oslo peace process in the 1990s, where the conclusion is always that it's all the fault of Palestinians, that the occupation has never ended, they'll say, Israel doesn't have a partner for peace, or the Arabs have turned down offers for a state, going back to fill in the blank, depending on your favorite propaganda narrative, or the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? They turned down a state at Camp David. Why didn't they accept the UN partition plan in 1947 when, by the way, the UN had zero authority, even according to its own rules, to decide how Palestine would be partitioned? What about the Peel Commission? Blah, 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 fucking blah. I'm sure you've heard these talking points before. Everyone has. In fact, if you're a minimally politically engaged person who cares about Palestine, you've heard all of this stuff literally thousands of times. So what's wrong with it? Well, a couple points. One thing that's important to note here is the premise is often, in fact, usually complete horseshit. Even assuming the desirability of a two-state solution as opposed to just creating a secular multi-ethnic democracy in the entire territory of the existing state, just taking the two-state approach as a given, there's never been a single Israeli government in the entire history of the country that has been ever willing to so much as consider, so much as entertain creating a real Palestinian state. What I mean by a real Palestinian state is a state that, first of all, would not be demilitarized. A demilitarized Palestinian state neighboring a regional hegemon with an uninterrupted history of military aggression against its neighbors, ask Lebanon, would be by definition a half-independent protectorate constantly bombed, bullied, and dominated by its regional superpower neighbor. That's not a real state. And what I also mean is that even if Israel withdrew all the way to its internationally recognized pre-1967 borders, that would leave Palestinians with 22% of the total territory, and the two components of the resulting state of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza, would already be geographically disconnected, right? That would be bad enough, but no Israeli government has ever even considered going that far. If you look at every proposal for a Palestinian state, even the most liberal Israeli governments have ever been willing to float since the late 1990s, which, by the way, was the first time since the 1940s that any Israeli government was willing to consider a two-state partition. What we're talking about is never Israel fulfilling its bare minimum legal obligation under international law to withdraw to the 1967 borders and leave the Palestinians with the entirety of the other 22% of the country to form a real Palestinian state with a Palestinian army and a Palestinian navy. We're always talking about plans, no matter how disguised by saying, oh, see, it's like 97% of the territory if you add it all up. So what are you guys complaining about? We're always talking about plans for some kind of strained, demilitarized Palestinian semi-state pockmarked by blocks of Israeli settlements annexed into Israel and crisscrossed by Israeli roads patrolled by Israeli soldiers. Calling that a two-state solution is a very bad joke. And again, everything I've said is easily verified in a few minutes, given even minimal competence at doing a Google search. But the premise being false isn't even the main thing that's wrong with this argument. A much bigger problem with these talking points, the Palestinians turned down a chance to have a state at Camp David. The Palestinians should have accepted the Peel proposal. The Palestinians should have accepted the 1947, UN plan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The much bigger problem with all of these talking points is, what the hell is this entity they're talking about? The Palestinians. Or even better, the Arabs. When people say things like, the Arabs attacked Israel in 1948, they've never accepted us. Is everyone in every country where Arabic is the national language part of a hive mind together? Even if we narrow it down to just the specific Palestinian ethnicity, is that entire ethnic group a hive mind? When people say the Americans did this or the Israelis did that, that's a shorthand way of saying the American state did this or the Israeli state did that. But there is no Palestinian state, and there never has been. There are two Palestinian factions, Hamas and Fatah, that each exercise a certain amount of power in different areas, and neither of which have, by the way, held an election of any kind in decades, since before most of the Palestinians being ethnically cleansed from Gaza right now were even born. And there are lots of other Palestinian factions with no power over anything. And of course, there are millions of individual Palestinians who don't all have the same political views any more than all Jews or all Americans or every member of any other ethnic group are all going to agree politically. So when you see sentences whose subject is the Palestinians, you shouldn't read that like a sentence with the subject the Israelis, where that's a shorthand for the Israeli state. we should treat those sentences, oh, the Palestinians did this, the Palestinians did that, Palestinians turned down an offer at Camp David, Palestinians used terrorism. We should treat those sentences in exactly the way you treat sentences whose subject is the Jews. Sentences which say, oh, the Jews did this or that. And I'm sure we'd all recognize in that context, you should distrust anyone who talks that way. And once you've realized that Palestinians are not, in fact, a hive mind any more than any other ethnic group is a hive mind, you should recognize that even if the premise was completely true, even if all these negotiations that have ever fallen apart were all the fault of Arafat or Abbas or some other Palestinian leader, this supposed fact would be 100% irrelevant to justifying the occupation. Complete irrelevance. Nothing that Arafat or Abbas or any other leader or faction could do under any circumstances could justify keeping millions of human beings in the status as rightless non-citizen subjects of the Israeli state for 57 years, or for that matter, for 1 year, for 57 days. And as with the, oh, it's not apartheid because of the Israeli Arabs argument, the Palestinians never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity argument is one where I think it's a mistake to get too bogged down in the weeds of the premise, because the really important action is at the inference. The really important point is that there's no remotely morally defensible premise that would take you, that from the premise that, oh, the negotiations breaking down is all the fault of this or that Palestinian leader, to the conclusion that therefore it's not a profound human rights violation to keep millions of people as rightless non-citizen subjects for 57 years. And that's the point I think we should be laser focused on in the response, rather than getting into the weeds of the negotiations. Because even if we pretended, for the sake of argument, that a negotiated two-state partition was impossible for some reason that was not Israel's fault at all, not even a little bit, and even if we further stipulate that for some reason Israel couldn't unilaterally withdraw, I don't know why that would be, but let's just stipulate it, then if you accept the most mind-numbingly basic premises about universal human rights, the premise that every human being has as much of a right to self-government as every other human being, I don't know, it doesn't get much more consensus-y than that as far as things we're supposed to believe as citizens of liberal democracies, then you would have no choice but to conclude that Israel should simply grant all Palestinians citizenship in the state where they already live and the state where they have lived for the last 57 years. And of course, Israel hasn't done that. They've occupied this territory for 57 years without either giving the people who live there equal rights in the state that currently rules them, or partitioning into two states so the Palestinians can finally become citizens of something and not permanently rightsless non-citizen Untermenschen. A Palestinian child born the day after Israel conquered this territory in their preemptive war of aggression in 1967 would be eligible for senior citizen discounts at restaurants today. And that child would have never spent a single day, right, between birth and senior citizen discount eligibility, enjoying all of the democratic rights that we all take for granted. Nothing about Arafat and Abbas, nothing about Camp David or Taba, nothing about the Peel Commission or the UN Partition Plan of 1947, or anything along those lines could ever make that even remotely defensible if you believe in universal human rights. And with that in mind, I want you to really think about something that I hear like clockwork every time there's one of these mowings of the lawn, which is that Israel has a right to defend itself. That phrase constitutes an infinitely flexible free pass for anything and everything Israel's military machine wants to do to the rightless and in practice mostly defenseless Palestinian population. But it's interesting, because here's something I have never heard come out of the mouth of any mainstream commentator ever. Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. Why not? If you're a member of this rightsless non-citizen subject population subjected to the jackboots of occupying soldiers in the West Bank, or unable to so much as approach the fence that's used to cage you in Gaza without being shot dead, if you've maybe seen your sister or your brother or your mother or your father or your grandmother or your cousin torn limb from limb by the bombs of that occupying army, why don't you have a right to defend yourself? The year 2023 was already the worst year on record for settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank before October 7th happened. There's an area that's about 10% of the West Bank that's been almost completely cleared of Palestinian inhabitants. And again, most of that happened in 2023. Hamas said in their statement explaining October 7th that it was done partially in retaliation for that. Now, if you want to say that the right of members of this oppressed population to defend themselves against the merciless military machine killing their relatives doesn't go far enough to justify killing or kidnapping random civilians, I actually completely agree with that. The current Israeli estimates hold that 695 Israeli civilians were killed on the 7th. I know there's a lot of discussion about friendly fire and the Hannibal Doctrine and all that, but let's just assume for the sake of argument, that 100% of those were killed by Hamas. Certainly lots of them were, right? There's footage the Hamas fighters took, filmed themselves of them killing random people. And even if we assume that the Hamas inflicted civilian death toll was only, say, 400, that's still terrible. But however much we condemn the killings of those people, hold that thought while we think about the Israeli military's murder of 48,000 directly Palestinians since October 7th. Again, by that extremely conservative estimate mentioned earlier, 109,000 maybe indirect deaths. Realistically, nearly all of them civilians, through the most indiscriminate bombing campaign in the recent history of warfare anywhere in the world. And what I just said is straightforwardly, unambiguously verifiable. More children were killed in the first couple months of Israel's campaign in Gaza than in all the war zones in the world in the previous couple of years. Compare the number of civilians killed in Gaza since last October 7th to Ukraine in well over twice that amount of time of Russia bombing them. Or say Iraqis in 2003, and the Gazan numbers dwarf those other numbers in absolute terms, never mind relative ones. And of course, we're talking about a territory whose total population is a small fraction of Iraq, never mind Ukraine. So tell me, given how much condemnation you have for those, let's say for the sake of argument, 695 Israeli civilians that were killed, how many times over should you condemn all those tens of thousands of dead civilians in Gaza if you really take seriously the idea that Palestinians are human beings just like Israelis or Americans? And that's not even to speak of the use of hunger as a weapon of war or a campaign to systematically eliminate the possibility of normal Palestinian life in Gaza, so thorough, so complete that the last university that was still standing in Gaza was blown up by the Israeli military, not through aerial bombardment, but by a controlled demolition. That's one of 1,000 signs that the long-term game plan is to create conditions that will get Gazans to agree to quote-unquote voluntary resettlement outside of the country. And it's not to speak of the displacement of a whole population so systematic and ruthless that, out of an estimated 2.3 million Gazans, who are alive before the war started, 1.9 million have been driven from their homes by the Israeli military in an operation that we're supposed to believe is designed to go after 30,000 Hamas fighters. That's not collateral damage. That's not just not being careful. That's intent. And I'm sorry, but the only thing you can call that is ethnic cleansing. You don't displace millions of people by accident. This is a crime on an entirely different level than October 7th. And if you don't pretend that the cycle of attacks and counterattacks, atrocities and counter-atrocities started on October 7th, so you can't just pretend that the clock starts there and everything that Israel does is just a response, right? Hamas, Hezbollah, those people act and Israel just reacts. And if you believe that members of the Palestinian population are people who have just as much of a right to self-defense as Israelis, then ask yourself, what would Palestinians have a right to do in response to this, right? The expulsion of millions of people, the creation of the world's largest population of child amputees in the tiny territory, civilian deaths dwarfing other conflicts around the world in the last few years. What would members of that Palestinian population have a right to do in response to all that if Israel has a right to do all that in response to the killing of 695 civilians? No defender of U.S. support for Israel has an answer to that question because they're simply not morally serious people. All the rights to defense they believe in only go in one direction. We're coming close to the end here, but there is just one last argument that we need to cover. We're told that it's all justified by Hamas using civilians as human shields. Let's think that one through. So this is the argument that, premise one, Hamas uses Palestinian civilians as human shield. The conclusion is Israel is justified in killing tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians with its bombs and displacing millions of others. So what premise two would you have to connect premise one to the conclusion? The premise is false, and premise one is false, and by the way, ludicrously hypocritical. But even if it were a sane premise, which it is not, the conclusion would not even begin to follow from that premise alone, at least not given any remotely defensible set of human values. So let's go through this piece by piece. First, why it's false, at least given a literal reading. And second, why it's ludicrously hypocritical, even given a very broad reading. And finally, and most importantly, why, even if it were true, it would not even begin to justify the conclusion. So, taken literally, the crime of the crime of human shielding in international law, the laws of war, is defined as directing the movements of civilians to protect military operations. Israel has often made this accusation against Hamas in the past, and after the last couple of lawn mowings, Amnesty International has investigated all the charges and countercharges of war crimes, and while Amnesty certainly doesn't love Hamas, and when they've done these investigations, they've certainly accused Hamas of violating other laws of war, they've actually consistently cleared Hamas of the accusation of human shielding after those previous conflicts. Maybe this time will be different, but I sure wouldn't count on it. And if you really want to guzzle the Kool-Aid, you can tell yourself, if you'd like, that Amnesty International is biased against Israel and Human Rights Watch is biased against Israel, and even the main Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, is somehow biased against Israel. But at a certain point, you have to take a step back and ask why every single otherwise respected human rights organization in the world is biased against Israel, and whether this is in fact the most parsimonious way to explain the data. By the way, Israel itself does have a long history of using literal human shielding, of doing things like forcing Palestinian civilians at gunpoint to walk in front of Israeli soldiers so the soldiers aren't shot at. The IDF used to do that as a matter of policy, and then Israel's high court said they had to stop, but that certainly didn't entirely stop the practice on the ground, and it certainly happened, in the war in the last year. If occupying soldiers don't really see Palestinians as people, and they clearly do not, then this is the kind of thing that simply is going to happen. But that's not even the main reason that Hamas uses Palestinian civilians as human shields defense of Israel's war crimes is so ludicrously hypocritical. The main reason is that I don't think people who say it typically mean the literal crime of human shielding under the laws of war, which, remember, means directing the movements of civilians to protect military operations. They just mean putting military stuff too close to civilian stuff, which is amazing, considering that Gaza is one of the most densely populated strips of land on the planet, 2.3 million people imprisoned in a 25-mile by 6 or 7-mile wide fence. And it's not like you could build an above-ground military base under the vigilant eyes of the lawnmowers, right? It'd be bombed to smithereens before, you started construction. But it's also amazing when it's coming from Americans or Israelis, because my God, think about how much military stuff is close to civilian stuff in our countries. My whole life, I've seen military recruitment offices and shopping centers If you go to the Army base in Fort Benning, Georgia, where, what used to be called the School of the Americas is located, there have been big protests there every year since forever, which is why I've been there. And I remember being struck by the residential houses literally lining both sides of the street right up until the street dead-ended into the gates of that supremely juicy military target. And Israel is actually way worse about putting military stuff close to civilian stuff than the United States is. So at the end of last year, I think, I did an article for Jacobin about the human shields talking point. While I was writing it, an Israeli friend pointed out to me that the Kiryat, that's the military base where Netanyahu meets with his war cabinet, it's actually in Tel Aviv rather than Jerusalem. And that building, which is surely the military target of all military targets, is right in the heart of downtown Tel Aviv. There's a huge shopping mall directly across the street where my friend said she'd often see uniformed soldiers eating lunch in the food court. There's a big high school right nearby. It's very close to the biggest hospital in the city, which, by the way, is connected to the Kiryat by tunnels. So the idea that Israel would accuse anyone of human shielding for not putting enough distance between military stuff and civilian stuff in this absolutely tiny strip of land is really incredible to me. And I know you might be thinking, if you know a little informal logic, Ben, isn't this just too coquet, right? The appeal to hypocrisy. Just because something's hypocritical doesn't mean that it's wrong. And you know what? Fair enough. But the reason I think that the hypocrisy is important to point out is because it focuses our minds on the absurd, gargantuan, towering double standards, which can then, lead us to say this has to be resolved in one direction or another if we want to be consistent. And then we can think about which direction we would actually find plausible. The fact is that no one in Israel or the United States would accept anything like the same reasoning in the opposite direction. That bombing the shit out of the United States or Israel in a way that was absolutely guaranteed to kill vastly more civilians than soldiers would be A-okay. It would be perfectly fine because the U.S. and Israel don't put their military stuff far enough away from their civilian stuff. That fact that no one would accept that argument in the other direction, certainly at least no American or Israeli would, is a relevant fact in this context because it makes us realize that the premise that you need for all of this stuff to make sense just is not consistently held by anyone anywhere. So just like with the Israeli Arabs having rights, so therefore it's not apartheid argument, just like with the never miss an opportunity to never miss an opportunity argument, let's really think about this one in the way that students are taught to do in introductory informal logic classes, labeling the premises and thinking about how those premises are supposed to fit together. If premise one is Hamas uses civilians as human shields, and the conclusion is that therefore, right, it's okay, right, it's justifiable to kill tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians as a predictable consequence of its bombing and displace millions of others, it seems to me that the only way to fit those together is if premise two is something like, if someone's being used as a human shield, you cannot be blamed for killing them along with the people using them in this way. Is that plausible? Would you accept that if we were talking about humans you actually cared about being used as human shields? My good friend Anna Kasparian was on the PBD podcast a little while back, and she said that she thought Israel's war crimes in Gaza amounted to genocide. She said, and I quote, "I'm an Armenian. I know genocide when I see one." And the host trotted out the human shield in defense. And Anna responded by asking him a very simple question. She said, "Hey, Patrick, do you have kids?" He said, "No." She said, "Okay, well, how about your mother? You mentioned your mother earlier. Imagine an actual hostage situation, a literal matter of human shielding, where a terrorist or a bank robber grabbed your mom and used her as a human shield. Would you then say that it would be perfectly okay for the cops to open fire on the bank robber to shoot him through your mom?" And of course, he dodged the question, just like you'd expect him to. Right? He said, "Oh, that's totally different," and he didn't explain why it's different. You can't blame him for not being able to answer Anna's question, really, because no one anywhere has a good answer to that question. But anyone who wants to make some version of the human shielding argument owes us a damn good answer to it. And anyone who wants to say that this is a straw man needs to tell me what your alternative candidate is for a premise 2 to connect our premise 1 with the conclusion. And frankly, good luck with that. This is all fine because human shielding, right? Human shielding, therefore, it doesn't matter how many civilians you kill, doesn't matter how many millions of civilians you displace, is an utterly morally indefensible proposition. But yeah, I still want you to try. I need to hear the alternative premise 2 that would make this argument work. I remember something Liz Brunig said once on Chapo about how half the point of a debate is to get the other person to tell you what they really think. And my God, that applies here. Because just like with libertarian arguments against giving people health care or conservative arguments against equality, Zionist arguments in defense of these atrocities get a hell of a lot harder to swallow once you make the implicit normative premises explicit and make people really think through how those premises would fit or fail to fit with anything even remotely recognizable as normal human values. And with that, we are going to go to the post game for patrons. So left is best.